Hey guys, tonight we step back to a time when the air could cut through your woolen tunic like a knife, and the ground was harder than your future dentist's drill. You trudge along the frostbitten paths of a medieval village, toes numb, breath puffing clouds in front of you, and already, you probably won't survive this without learning a few tricks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me your location and local time. It's always fun to know who's joining me in this cozy insomnia club. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day begins before the sun has even bothered to yawn over the horizon. Oh. You pull your cloak tighter, ears tingling as frost cracks underfoot, and the smell of frozen earth mingles with the faint tang of last night's cooking fires. Dawn is a merciless hour in the winter months, but peasants had a rhythm for it, an almost ritualistic choreography of survival. Torches are lit, or half embers coaxed back to life. Kettles of water thaw over flames that sputter against damp, smoke-blackened chimneys. Historians still argue whether these early morning routines were learned from necessity or passed down with a sprinkling of superstition. But either way, missing them could mean frostbite before breakfast. You rub your eyes, noticing how your breath fogs in short, desperate bursts, and realize the first act of the day is warmth itself. Some peasants would start with a brisk walk around the yard, or a quick dash to the barn, using movement to generate internal heat before the chill sinks in completely. Others lingered by the hearth, tossing small kindling sticks onto smoldering coals, breathing in the woody, smoky scent that smells like home, but also like survival. Fringe accounts suggest that in certain villages, children would stomp in icy puddles barefoot, supposedly to toughen the blood, which is as questionable as it sounds, but some swear by its effectiveness. Then comes the ritualistic tending of firewood. You lift rough-hewn logs, feeling splinters bite your palms, and arrange them so the flame spreads evenly. An art as vital as any painter's brushstroke. Peasants often layered wood strategically, softer, resinous kinds for ignition, denser oaks to sustain heat. Oddly, some would sprinkle dried herbs into flames, claiming that rosemary or thyme released not just fragrance, but protective magic against illness. You inhale cautiously. Yes, it smells nice, but it's also a reminder that medieval practicality and superstition were rarely separate. Oddly, as light inches over rooftops, you notice frost-coated thatch, and hear the muffled clucks of chickens trapped in their coop, bodies pressed together for warmth. Early chores continue. Water from wells must be hauled carefully. Buckets weigh heavier in freezing hands, and any delay could mean frozen spouts or cracked wood. You recall tales of villagers who carved ice channels in the ground to direct runoff safely, an engineering feat that seems excessive, but probably saved more than one slippered foot from disaster. The globe, iron, green. And through it all, you can't escape the sensory overlay of medieval life. The smoky tang of hearths, the sharp bite of wind through gaps in walls, the wet crunch of frost beneath boots. There's rhythm here, even in the cold, an intuitive understanding of survival passed down in hushed whispers and early morning chatter. Light finally brushes frost-laden fields, revealing the outline of frozen vegetables in gardens, the subtle sheen on roof tiles, and the occasional wandering cat, whose reputation for magical warmth makes it a valued companion. Remember that, because you'll meet this feline warmth strategy again in later sections. Some historians still argue whether these early hours were more about practical survival or social conformity. Were peasants up at dawn because they had to, or because their neighbors did first? Respect. And finally, the truth likely wobbles somewhere in between, like an icy puddle under a cartwheel. And while you shuffle toward the breakfast potions of porridge and broth, You realize that every motion, every choice, every ritual, no matter how quirky, was part of a delicate balancing act between life, frost, and the faint hope of a warm evening. By the time the sun is fully above the horizon, the village is alive in its quiet, laborious way. Smoke rises, animals stir, and you, like every peasant before you, have already performed a dozen silent, shivering rites of survival. The cold hasn't won yet, and you can feel it retreat slightly from the day's rhythm. You glance at a frozen cartwheel, wondering if it will thaw by lunchtime, or if you'll just have to kick it harder, because medieval ingenuity often relied on brute force first, subtlety second. You stretch, feeling muscles stiff from both sleep and early labor, and allow yourself a moment of grudging admiration for the ingenuity that has carried countless souls through similar mornings. Amidst the judgment, a sole wife, and as your gaze sweeps over that frost-dusted horizon, you can almost hear the whispers of history. Each step, each flicker of fire, each shared glance of understanding among neighbors, all part of a choreography that kept life moving, even when the cold threatened to stop it entirely. You shrug into your layered clothing, feeling the rough scratch of linen beneath wool, and the odd scratchier patch where a patch of sheepskin has been stitched in. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of sleek thermal gear or waterproof fabrics. Every layer was a negotiation between warmth, mobility, and what their wallets, or barter skills, could manage. You probably wouldn't think twice about fashion, but imagine pulling on tunics that reek faintly of last week's stew, and yet, somehow, each layer is life itself. Historians still argue whether layering was more about insulation or social display. After all, even the poorest wanted to look at least modestly presentable for neighbors, though practicality almost always won. Wool is king here. It traps air, even when damp, and your body heat becomes a warm bubble cocooning you from the cruel air outside. Beneath that, you have linen, soft against the skin and good for wicking sweat, a tiny convenience that modern hikers would kill for. Fringe accounts, however, tell of peasants tucking small sprigs of fragrant herbs like lavender or mint between layers, believing that the scent kept not only the chill away, but also warded off evil spirits. You lift an arm to adjust the bulky tunic, and the scent of wool mixed with herbs reminds you that survival and superstition often walked hand in hand. Animal hides also play a part, though sparingly. A sheepskin draped over shoulders, a rabbit pelt stitched inside a cloak, or even leftover leather scraps fashioned into makeshift mittens or leggings. All these augment warmth. You tug at your sleeve and feel the uneven textures, wondering if the medieval tailor would have been offended. The feeds destructive and silent. Warm leaves move always away from the flame. There's also talk among historians about whether certain layers were gendered, with men wearing heavier outer layers and women adding extra underlayers, though evidence is murky, and some argue it varied wildly by region and household wealth. The peasant's approach to accessories is surprisingly sophisticated. Hats, hoods, and rudimentary gloves were essential. Without them, the extremities succumbed first. Oddly, in some villages, mittens were filled with straw or wool scraps to act like mini insulators, an early prototype of the padded glove. Footwear was equally critical. Heavy boots, often made from layered leather, might be stuffed with straw overnight. Fringe stories even mention peasants tucking hot stones inside boots before bedtime, a risky move that could toast toes if mishandled, but in desperate frost, worth the gamble. You notice that color and texture weren't just for survival. They were markers of resourcefulness. A patchwork sleeve wasn't shameful. It was practical, a testament to thrifty hands who salvaged every scrap of material. Historians still debate the extent to which these decorative patches reflected fashion versus sheer necessity, but in your hands, they feel like both armor and statement. You tug your patched sleeve tighter against the draft, shivering slightly at the breeze that sneaks under poorly fitted doors. Underneath all this, undergarments were surprisingly functional. Linen shifts, sometimes bleached but often reused until fraying, created a basic layer that prevented chafing from heavier outer layers. Oddly, some traditions included sleeping in the same garments worn outside for days at a stretch, relying on body heat to keep linens from freezing solid overnight. Fringe anecdotes even suggest peasants believed that wearing clothes imbued with the warmth of day work into the night somehow protected against cold spirits, a belief that makes you giggle while tugging at your scarf. Layering wasn't just physical, it involved technique. You learned to trap air pockets between garments, shifting folds to insulate areas like elbows and knees. Heavy belts could cinch layers, reducing gaps, while shawls or scarves could be wound multiple times around the torso, neck, and even face. Some historians still debate whether these techniques were consciously developed as thermal science or stumbled upon by trial, error, and a lot of frostbitten fingertips. Either way, it works. You tug a woolen hood over your head, and the chill retreats just enough to make the outside world tolerable. Then comes the surprisingly social aspect. Families often coordinated who would wear what in order to maximize heat efficiency within crowded cottages. You squeeze past siblings in the morning, each layer overlapping, sharing body warmth almost unknowingly. There's also evidence of small, layer-sharing rituals, borrowed mittens, patched cloaks handed down, which speak to a cooperative survival instinct that modern life has largely erased. Fringe reports mention certain village elders insisting on specific combinations of cloths and furs for spiritual or superstitious reasons, adding yet another layer of complexity. As you adjust your outer tunic, tugging stray fibers into place, you realize that each piece is simultaneously armor, comfort, and superstition. Wool, linen, hides, belts, hats, and mittens form a multi-layered defense system against winter's bite, and the small rituals of scent, patchwork, and shared warmth amplify the effect. Even with these precautions, your fingers tingle and toes protest, a reminder that no layering system, however clever, was perfect. And yet, the ingenuity is impressive. Centuries before modern thermal fabrics, medieval peasants were quietly engineering microclimates on their very bodies. You glance at your reflection in a frozen puddle, imagining the layered silhouettes of your neighbors, and appreciate the delicate art behind something as mundane as getting dressed. Each wrinkle, fold, and scratchy patch is a survival story, a tiny rebellion against the cold. And as you step toward the yard, chest and limbs wrapped in centuries of practical wisdom, you feel ready to face frost, wind, and even the occasional village superstition, knowing that every layer is a small triumph. You crouch by the hearth, feeling the uneven warmth of the stones beneath your hands, and realize that heating a medieval home was as much art as labor. Hearths were the heartbeat of cottages, but they weren't just fireplaces. They were central gathering spots, cooking stations, and essential warmth sources rolled into one. Clay tiles sometimes lined the floor near the hearth to radiate heat long after embers died down, while large stones were strategically placed in beds to store warmth overnight. Fringe accounts suggest that some villages would even heat stones over the fire and wrap them in cloth, then tuck them under the covers. Basically, a medieval hot water bottle, though with slightly more risk of a singed sheet. You notice the clever way smoke is managed. Chimneys were rare in the earliest cottages, so smoke often escaped through gaps in the roof, or a simple hood over the hearth. This meant the room filled with a dense, pungent fog that made eyes water, but it also created an insulating layer, trapping some of the heat where it mattered. Historians still argue whether these smoky conditions were more a necessity of limited technology or a calculated decision to maintain warmth. Either way, your lungs are learning their own tolerance for survival. Why? Bedstones, surprisingly, play a critical role too. You kneel to inspect one and imagine climbing onto it at night. These large, flat rocks would be heated during the day and left to slowly radiate warmth into straw mattresses.
Whoa.
Some families layered straw or rushes over the stones to retain heat longer. Fringe sources claim that in certain regions, peasant households might even rotate stones between hearth and bed, maximizing the thermal transfer. You can almost feel the ingenuity, even if it comes at the cost of stiff joints in the morning. You glance at the hearth tools, pokers, tongs, and shovels that look more like miniature weapons than practical implements. Keeping the fire alive overnight required constant attention. Tiny sparks could spell disaster for a home built largely of timber and thatch. Oddly, there are reports of fire bats, flat wooden paddles used to stir embers, that seem more ritualistic than practical, perhaps to scare away spirits believed to steal warmth. You poke at a dying ember and can't help but smile at the creativity mixed with superstition. Smoke, stones, and careful layering weren't the only tricks. Some peasants embedded small clay pipes or channels in their walls, allowing heat from the hearth to circulate through other rooms. While evidence is sparse, fringe scholars claim certain villages had early versions of what you might call a primitive radiator system. You lean back, imagining a warm corridor while the wind whistles outside, and appreciate that survival often inspired innovation centuries ahead of its time. Sleeping arrangements tied directly into heating strategies. Beds were often clustered near hearths, with shared blankets and heated stones tucked underneath. Fringe accounts suggest some peasants even used hollowed logs filled with embers at the foot of beds to create localized warmth. Historians still argue whether these methods were widespread or reserved for the wealthier villages who could spare the risk. But the principle is clear. Medieval heat management was about efficiency, improvisation, and sheer stubborn willpower. You stand, brushing ash from your hands, and glance around the room. Every object, from clay pots to timber beams, has a role in trapping, reflecting, or radiating warmth. Even the placement of furniture was deliberate. Low tables and benches often blocked drafts, while beds were positioned against interior walls to avoid luring heat to the cold. Fringe reports claim some villages would hang blankets over doorways to seal off cold air, creating microclimates within each room. You wrap your cloak tighter, noting that every little detail adds up in this carefully orchestrated battle against frost. And yet, for all the cleverness, mornings were not guaranteed to be comfortable. Cold seeped through floors and walls, embers died faster than expected, and the occasional night wind sneaked through tiny gaps. Still, the combination of layered clothing, strategic stone placement, and relentless attention to fire kept families alive. You glance at a small, soot-blackened hearth, realizing that in this world, warmth wasn't a luxury, it was a measure of life itself, and every ember carefully nurtured carried with it the weight of survival, superstition, and ingenuity. You lift a steaming bowl of porridge to your lips, feeling the warmth spread through your chest, and realize that food was as much a tool against the cold as your layered clothing or heated stones. Medieval peasants didn't just eat to stave off hunger, They eat to generate internal heat, with every calorie carefully considered. Broths, stews, and gruels were thick, often spiced with whatever herbs were on hand, and consumed not just for flavor, but for their ability to warm the body from within. Fringe records even described villages adding chili-like spices long before they were common in Europe, believing that heat in the mouth translated to heat in the limbs. Porridge itself, often made from oats or barley, was more than sustenance. It was armor against frost. You scoop another mouthful and notice how the warm, semi-liquid texture immediately eases the ache of cold fingers. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were optimally balanced or driven purely by seasonal availability, but evidence suggests peasants were acutely aware of which foods gave longer-lasting warmth. Some even mixed fat from animals into their grains, a simple yet effective way to boost caloric intake and stave off hypothermia. Hot drinks played a surprisingly significant role. Water was boiled over the hearth, sometimes with added herbs or honey, creating simple teas that seared the throat and circulated warmth through chilled bodies. Fringe tales describe villagers carrying small clay cups filled with hot water, secretly placing them in beds or under cloaks, a precursor to modern heating pads. You take a careful sip and feel the trickle of warmth travel down your chest, appreciating the cleverness of such low-tech solutions. You notice the social rhythm surrounding meals. Families often ate together near the hearth, combining the benefits of shared body heat with caloric intake. Cooking was a group activity. One person stirring a bubbling pot, while another tended to fuel, and a child adding herbs or cracking grains. Historians still debate whether this communal dining was purely practical or also a social necessity, a way to maintain morale during punishing winters. Either way, the heat of the kitchen radiated outward, turning the act of eating into a small festival of warmth and sustenance. Seasonal preservation was another survival tactic. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, stored in cold but not frozen cellars, were slowly cooked into hearty stews. Dried legumes, salted meats, and preserved fats allowed peasants to maintain caloric intake when fresh food was scarce. Fringe accounts even mention the occasional use of heated stones dropped directly into cooking pots, a method to speed up simmering while adding thermal mass to the meal, a risky but clever workaround for fuel shortages. You spoon the thick stew into a smaller bowl, inhaling the aroma of simmered onions and herbs. The smell itself is comforting, mingling with the smoke of the hearth, creating an olfactory shield against the chill. You recall tales of villagers tossing in fragrant herbs, not just for taste, but because they believed that certain scents could warm the blood and protect against winter illnesses. Scholars still question how much of this was superstition versus practical knowledge, but it underscores a medieval mindset that saw every element of daily life as interconnected with survival. Even snacks served a dual purpose. Roasted nuts, dried fruits, and small morsels of meat were portable heat sources, eaten between tasks to maintain energy and warmth. Some fringe sources mention villagers carrying tiny pouches of dried chili peppers, just in case the cold threatened to dull their senses. Historians debate whether these spiced interventions were widespread or limited to specific regions with early access to exotic imports. But imagining a frost-bitter hand clutching a fiery pepper certainly brings a smile. By midday, the cumulative effect of food and movement is palpable. Bodies hum with warmth, and the cold, while still sharp outside, has less immediate power over you. Yet you remain aware that sustenance alone is not enough. Continuous care of clothing, careful tending of fires, and strategic layering all reinforce the thermal shield food has begun. The intertwining of nutrition, superstition, and sheer necessity creates a rhythm in the village. Eat, warm, move, repeat, each act reinforcing the next. You set down the bowl, savoring the final spoonful, and glance round. Steam rises from pots and troughs, mingling with the cold, creating an almost mystical fog of survival. In these small rituals, heating, eating, sharing, and seasoning, medieval peasants built not just bodies resistant to winter, but a culture of cleverness and resilience. You wrap your hands around the last cup of herbal tea, feeling the heat seep into your fingers, and realize that every meal is a tiny victory over the season's relentless chill, a victory that has echoed through centuries. You shuffle into the barn, the chill of the morning still clinging to your shoulders, and immediately notice the warmth radiating from the animals huddled inside. Livestock were more than food and trade. In medieval cottages, they were living heaters. Pigs, sheep, and even chickens provided small pockets of heat, and clever peasants arranged sleeping quarters so that animals shared body warmth with humans. Fringe sources suggest that cats were especially prized, not just for pest control, but because their small bodies generated surprisingly concentrated warmth, and some villagers believed their pairing could literally mend frozen bones. You kneel beside a group of pigs, feeling the dense heat radiate from their bodies, and remember that not all animal companionship was purely practical. Tales abound of villagers speaking to their beasts, whispering encouragements or complaints alike, and scholars still argue whether these interactions were pragmatic or shaped by deeper cultural bonds. Battle. Either way, there's no denying the proximity to a live, warm body made a bitter winter morning far more tolerable. The barn is layered with straw, which itself acts as insulation, trapping heat from both animals and humans. You step carefully, the dry rustle underfoot, muffling the creak of timber wars. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some peasants would lay a straw beneath sleeping mats at night, then sprinkle it with aromatic herbs like rosemary to keep rodents and winter spirits at bay. Ah, cess bread. You lift a handful, inhaling the faint scent of hay and dried herbs, and can almost feel centuries of practice in this simple act. Body heat was strategic. People slept close to animals at night, sometimes even in the same small rooms when space permitted. Cats curled at the edge of beds, dogs at the foot, and larger animals like pigs or sheep in a designated corner. Historians still debate whether this practice was more about maximizing thermal efficiency or a simple reflection of cramped living conditions, but the results were clear. Warmth was a community affair, shared across species. There were also superstitions tied to these animal alliances. Fringe reports mention villages who believed certain animals could absorb cold, or still winter, while you slept, and special charms or rituals were sometimes performed before bed. You glance at a dozing cat and can't help but chuckle at the idea that it's secretly a magical heating device, a notion that blends practicality and myth in the way only medieval life could. The placement of animals was deliberate. Larger livestock often stayed close to outer walls, providing insulation for the building, while smaller animals were allowed near hearths or human sleeping areas to radiate direct warmth. Now, some French sources even describe peasants lining animal stalls with heated stones or embers overnight, a risky technique, but one that amplified the thermal effect for the humans nearby. You crouch and feel the residual warmth from yesterday's hearthstones beneath a layer of straw, appreciating the multiple levels of thermal ingenuity. Even chores incorporated animal heat. Milking in the pre-dawn chill became easier when cows or goats had been fed and kept in strawed warmth. The act of grooming or feeding animals was also an opportunity to absorb their heat and keep circulation moving in frost-numbed limbs. Scholars still argue whether these routines were primarily survival-driven or socially reinforced habits, but to you, each touch and motion feels like centuries of carefully honed wisdom. And you pause to watch a small dog curl against a child's leg, ears twitching, eyes half closed. The shared warmth, the rhythm of breathing, and even the soft fur under fingertips all combine into a microcosm of winter survival. The animals are part of a system, living heaters, companions, and sometimes silent teachers of resilience. Fringe tales even suggest that villages believed certain animals had particular affinities for cold-prone humans, assigning them to specific family members for optimal heat. As you leave the barn, warmth lingering in your boots and fingers, you reflect on the delicate balance achieved here, humans and animals interwoven into a single survival strategy. Every huddle, every shared body, every soft purr or grunt contributes to a system that transforms brutal frost into a tolerable, even manageable, daily experience. You step back into the frozen air, grateful for the lessons of centuries-old ingenuity, and realize that animals were not just companions, they were essential co-survivors in the medieval struggle against winter's chill. And you step back into the village square, the wind tugging at your layered cloak, and immediately notice how every hut, barn, and fence has been arranged to combat winter. Shelter, in medieval times, was a delicate negotiation between available materials, structural integrity, and thermal efficiency. Mud, straw, timber, each contributed both to insulation and to a sense of security against the elements. You run your hand along a timber wall, feeling the rough grain beneath fingertips, and realize that every groove, every thatch layer, every packed mud patch has been placed with cold-fighting intent. Windows are tiny, almost apologetic, letting in just enough light to see, but minimizing the frigid air that could slip through. Scholars still argue whether these diminutive panes were primarily defensive, meant to deter theft and wandering animals, or purely thermal, likely a bit of both. You peer through one, and notice frost curling delicately around the edges, a natural reminder of why size mattered more than clarity in these freezing months. Fringe accounts even mention that shutters were sometimes lined with cloth or animal hides at night, adding a second barrier against frost, though you imagine it made the room feel like a sauna at first touch. It's suddenly, thatch roofs, thick and layered, provide more than water protection. Straw and reeds act as insulation, trapping warmth inside while preventing cold winds from invading. Ice. You brush some loose straw aside, imagining the meticulous work required to maintain them through months of snow and ice. Fringe tales claim that some peasants would add extra layers each year, not just for insulation, but because local folklore suggested frost clings less to thick hair, a superstition that likely originated from careful observation over generations. Toad. Flooring was equally critical. Packed earth could be sprinkled with straw, rushes, or even animal skins to reduce heat loss. Some wealthier households had clay tiles that absorbed heat from the hearth and radiated it slowly through the night, a rudimentary but effective form of radiant flooring. Beyond, fringe reports hint at households placing heated stones beneath floors or beneath rush-covered bedding to provide localized warmth. Risky, but undeniably effective. Historians still debate how common such techniques were, but they illustrate the ingenuity embedded in even the simplest cottages. You notice the clever layout of the village itself. Houses are clustered tightly, creating windbreaks and shared warmth in the narrow lanes. And of Courtyards and common areas are planned to maximize sunlight exposure during winter months, while barns and storage huts block prevailing winds. Fringe sources suggest that in some regions, villagers would even rotate livestock stalls seasonally, placing the most heat-producing animals closest to the homes during the coldest months. You marvel at this coordination, realizing that the survival of an entire community depended not just on individual cunning, but on collective spatial planning. Even minor construction details matter. Doors are often double-layered with wooden planks and cloth. Chimneys are angled to draw smoke efficiently while retaining heat, and small alcoves or benches are positioned against interior walls to reduce drafts. Fringe anecdotes tell of some families stacking extra firewood against exterior walls at night to act as temporary insulation, a flexible barrier that could be adjusted based on wind direction or frost intensity. After the soul marks the 3/10 of sleep, historians still argue whether these practices were widespread innovations or isolated to particularly inventive households. But the logic is undeniable. Every barrier, every layer counts. You step inside one of the cottages and immediately notice the thermal gradient. The space closest to the hearth is toasty, the corners near doors chillingly cold. Furniture placement is deliberate. Benches block drafts, beds hug interior walls, and heavy curtains or hanging tie-tails further trap heat. Fringe reports even describe small, suspended canopies over beds, acting as heat tents that captured body warmth and kept the night chill at bay. You crouch near one and feel how effective a simple fabric layer can be against cold. Even the humble roof beam has a role. Packed tightly with timber, it supports not just the structure, but also acts as an insulator against cold air from above. Fringe anecdotes suggest that in some communities, decorative carvings on beams were thought to trap warmth, symbolically, blending superstition with construction. You brush your fingers over a carved motif, smiling at the mixture of artistry and practical thinking. By the time you leave the cottage, you realize that every inch of shelter, from roof to floor, window to door, is part of a carefully orchestrated survival strategy. Here, mud, straw, and timber aren't just building materials. They're armor against frost, a quiet testament to centuries of observation, innovation, and a little superstition sprinkled in. Here. You step into the crisp air, grateful that these homes offer refuge, and understand that medieval shelter was never just a roof over the head. It was a carefully crafted microclimate, designed to keep life going in the coldest nights imaginable. Well, here. You tighten your cloak and glance nervously down the shadowed lane, realizing that freezing nights were not only a battle against temperature, but also against the unpredictable dangers lurking in the dark. Whispering, balance. Nighttime vigilance was an essential part of peasant life. Wolves prowled nearby forests, foxes scavenged for livestock, and, occasionally, fellow villagers tempted by desperation might test locks and doors. You probably wouldn't think about neighborly theft in your modern home, but for a medieval peasant, every creak in the frost-bitter silence demanded attention. Historians still argue whether fear of wildlife or of human intrusion played a larger role in nightly routines. But either way, survival required alertness. You step closer to the hearth, where family members huddle together, weapons or improvised tools at the ready. Torchlight dances on faces, illuminating expressions that blend weariness with readiness. Fringe accounts suggest that some households would leave out small charms or offerings near doors, intended to appease spirits called frost demons, believed to wander the village at night, chilling any house they passed. You can't help but smile at the idea of supernatural accountability keeping both peasants and temperature in check. Even the act of sleeping demanded strategy. Doors were reinforced with wooden bars or heavy cloth coverings to block drafts and intruders alike. Windows were covered, and sometimes even small gaps in walls were stuffed with straw or rags. Fringe reports tell of villagers who would sprinkle salt along thresholds, not just for superstition, but because they noticed that it absorbed moisture, which could otherwise seep through cracks and lower indoor temperatures. Scholars still debate the prevalence of such practices, but in a world without central heating, every layer of defense mattered. Nighttime routines extended beyond mere defense. You notice that some villagers keep small braziers or ember-filled pots near entrances, providing a gentle radiating heat to stave off frost and allow safe passage. Fringe sources describe clever devices like swinging fire lamps that could illuminate hallways while distributing warmth, a bit like an early mobile radiator. You step past one and feel the subtle difference in air temperature, marveling at the ingenuity required to maintain comfort without modern technology. Animals, too, played a crucial role in vigilance. Dogs slept near entrances, alert to any movement, while livestock in adjoining rooms added both heat and a buffer against intruders, human or otherwise. You crouch beside a dozing dog, noting how its warmth and presence combine with the hearth to create a defensive microclimate. Historians still debate whether the pairing of humans and animals in sleeping quarters was primarily practical, or if superstition about protective beasts influenced the arrangement. But the dual benefit is undeniable. Even chores took on a protective dimension at night. Carrying water from frozen wells or fetching firewood required careful timing and route planning. Fringe accounts described villagers using reflective surfaces or glimmering ice to detect movement in the dark, a low-tech early warning system that blends observation with a touch of creative paranoia. You imagine stomping carefully on frost-crusted paths, eyes straining for shapes in the dim moonlight, and feel the tension that defined every frigid night. Superstition intertwined seamlessly with vigilance. Bells, simple charms, and spoken warnings were believed to ward off frost demons, spirits, and evil intent alike. You watch a villager whisper to a small amulet over the hearth, a gesture that combines the practical, focusing attention and reminding oneself of danger, with the mystical. Historians still debate whether these practices were rooted in genuine belief or acted as psychological reinforcement, but in effect, they added another layer of mental preparedness against the harshness of winter. As the night deepens, your senses sharpen. The slightest crack of wood, a muted howl from the nearby forest, or the scurrying of small creatures triggers instinctive awareness. You hug yourself, appreciating the warmth of both clothing and strategy, and realize that vigilance isn't merely defensive. It's a rhythm, a constant negotiation with the environment. Fringe sources even suggest that in certain villages, small groups would rotate nighttime watchers, creating a communal alert system that balanced sleep, warmth, and protection. By the time you return to the hearth, embers glowing and animals settled, you understand that surviving a medieval night required a blend of alertness, superstition, and clever use of every resource. I love you. I want to know you. The cold is relentless, but so is the human will to resist it. You feel the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a night where frost, predators, and chance all compete for dominance. And you realize that vigilance is as much about mindset as it is about warmth or weaponry. In this intricate dance of survival, every creak, spark, and whisper has its purpose, and nothing, neither frost nor fear, can be ignored. You trudge through a thin layer of morning frost, the chill biting your cheeks, and realize that medieval presence often relied on motion itself as a tool against cold. Walking, chopping wood, hauling water. Every small task served to keep blood circulating and muscles warm. You lift a bucket from the frozen ground and notice how the weight demands attention, forcing focus away from the biting air. Historians still argue whether this constant activity was learned instinctively or deliberately structured, but the result is the same. Motion is life, and stagnation is frostbite. Some tasks are oddly creative in their thermal function. You notice that when peasants dig through snow or ice-covered soil to reach hidden roots, they often work in rhythmic patterns, conserving energy while generating consistent heat. Fringe accounts even suggest that groups would chant or sing while performing laborious tasks, believing that vocal vibration somehow stirred warmth into the body. You hum softly as you swing an imaginary axe, feeling the truth in the adage that moving creates heat. Though probably not enough to justify full-on singing in a blizzard. Workspaces themselves were designed with efficiency and warmth in mind. Small sheds or barns often had side openings covered with cloth to allow light but block the wind. You step carefully over frozen mud and straw, realizing that these micro-environments were as much about survival as convenience. Fringe stories describe heat corridors, narrow lanes between buildings where tasks like wood chopping or food prep were centralized, capturing residual warmth from neighboring structures. Historians still debate whether this was intentional urban planning or accidental byproduct, but either way, it worked. Children were not exempt from these strategies. They were taught early to combine play with practical labor. Snow-packed pathways became training grounds for endurance, while games sometimes involved carrying heavy loads or stacking firewood, effectively building both strength and internal warmth. Fringe accounts suggest some villages held playful frost contests, racing across frozen fields barefoot or in thin shoes to prove resilience. Scholars argue whether this was genuinely widespread or merely local folklore, but the image sticks. Childhood as both recreation and survival boot camp. Cooking outdoors also had surprising advantages. Fire pits, or small hearths in courtyards, allowed large groups to work together while sharing heat. You stir a pot of root stew and feel the radiating warmth against your fingers. Fringe accounts claim that villagers sometimes preheated outdoor surfaces, with stones heated by prior fires, creating pockets of temporary warmth to stand on while cooking or preparing food. Scholars still debate whether this was widespread or a localized eccentricity, but it illustrates the ingenuity in every corner of daily life. Clothing maintenance becomes a task in itself. Wet gloves or boots can sap warmth rapidly, so peasants would wring, dry, and sometimes restuff them with straw. You tug at a glove and realize that insulating items while performing chores was as critical as the work itself. Fringe sources mention villagers rubbing animal fat into leather footwear, not just for water resistance, but to retain warmth. A messy, smelly practice, but undeniably effective. Historians still argue whether these methods were regional necessities or broadly applied survival techniques, but the logic is simple. Damp hands and feet equal misery. Even rest periods were structured to maintain heat. Short breaks meant huddling near walls, warming hands over embers, or pressing close to fellow workers or animals. Fringe anecdotes describe using heated stones on laps or wrapped in cloth as temporary hand warmers, a method that sounds uncomfortable but delivers immediate relief. You pause, imagining the shared warmth in a crowded barn or cottage, and feel a quiet appreciation for how human ingenuity stretches to every aspect of life. By the end of these morning tasks, your body hums with the accumulated heat from movement, labor, and shared warmth. Frost still clings to the landscape, but within your layered garments and active circulation, it feels less threatening. You glance over the village, noting the choreographed rhythm, motion generating heat, structures preserving it, and rituals, both practical and fringe, woven seamlessly into every action. The medieval day, you realize, is not just endured, it's orchestrated, a blend of work, superstition, and clever observation that keeps life moving when winter is at its harshest. You trudge toward the frozen river, the chill gnawing at exposed skin, and realize that water itself is both a resource and a threat. Medieval peasants depended on rivers, streams, and wells for drinking, cooking, and washing, but frozen water meant a constant negotiation with temperature. Buckets would crack, ice formed stubborn barriers, and fetching water became a test of endurance. Finger counts even described villages breaking ice with heated stones, a risky but effective method to access the vital liquid without prolonged exposure. Historians still argue whether winter water management was an art developed deliberately or an improvisation born from necessity, but survival depended on it. Money. You lift a bucket and feel the cold bite through gloves that are already stiff from frost. Some peasants employed layered hand coverings or straw-stuffed gloves, allowing fingers to remain functional while handling frigid containers. Finch sources suggest placing small cloths in the bottom of buckets to insulate the hands from direct contact with ice, a clever yet often forgotten technique. You watch your breath fog and condense on the ice-crusted river, realizing that even minor adjustments could mean the difference between frostbite and comfort. Rivers and ponds were also a source of food, and fishing in winter required careful planning. You notice holes drilled through the ice or nets suspended in partially frozen streams. Pay. Finge accounts claim that some peasants used heated hooks or stones to keep holes open, and certain villages even timed fishing at specific hours of day, believing that water temperature and light affected fish behavior. Scholars still debate whether these practices were widespread or anecdotal, but the principle is clear. Survival required adaptation to nature's frozen patterns. Water transport and storage indoors were just as critical. Feed, clay jugs, wooden barrels, and leather skins were used to carry water from the source to cottages. To prevent freezing, peasants sometimes wrapped containers in straw or cloth and kept them near the hearth or inside insulated storage rooms. Finji reports suggest that some villages even placed water-filled containers near small fires at intervals to create a thermal buffer against freezing. Historians still argue about the frequency and effectiveness of these methods, but their ingenuity is undeniable. Hygiene was another tricky balance. Washing in ice-cold rivers was uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, yet maintaining some cleanliness was necessary for health. Some peasants timed washing with the warmest part of the day, or heated small basins of water over the fire. Fringe accounts describe ingenious methods like carrying heated colored fruit and stones into basins to warm water without excessive fuel usage, a practice that required precision and patience. Scholars still debate how widespread such techniques were. But the principle of maximizing warmth while minimizing effort is consistent. You glance at the riverbanks and notice that paths are lined with straw, weeds, or other insulators. Some villages would create stepping mats to protect feet from frozen mud or ice, and fringe accounts even mention small, portable wooden platforms used as temporary insulation while performing chores near icy water. Historians argue whether these innovations were standard survival strategies or localized curiosities, but the careful attention to minimizing contact with frozen surfaces is impressive. Even storage of water and food combined thermal awareness with superstition. Fringe stories claim that villages would sprinkle certain herbs or grains into water or storage areas to protect against winter spirits, or to keep water fresh. For a moment, crystal food, longer. You peer into a clay jug, imagining a tiny ritual designed as much to reassure the mind as to preserve physical well-being. But they illustrate the medieval mindset where superstition and survival are inseparable. By midday, you feel the subtle burn in your arms and legs from carrying, breaking, and fetching. Water, once a simple resource, becomes a test of patience, ingenuity, and endurance. The frozen river is no longer just a natural feature, it's a partner in the dance of survival, requiring respect, planning, and clever improvisation. Every bucket lifted, every hole drilled, every stone heated is a small triumph against the harsh grip of winter. And you realize that life in this frozen landscape is less about convenience and more about relentless adaptation. You step into the village kitchen, the scent of yesterday's stew still lingering, and notice how cooking is both an art and a survival mechanism. Every fire, pot, and utensil is positioned to maximize warmth and efficiency. In many cottages, meals were prepared over open hearths that served dual purposes, providing heat to the room and nourishing the body. Fringe accounts suggest that peasants sometimes built small heat boxes, using bricks or stones near the fire to slowly warm bread or grains throughout the day. All white, CS8. Effectively creating a passive oven. Historians still argue whether such devices were common or experimental, but their ingenuity is undeniable. You stir a thick porridge and feel the heat radiate through the wooden spoon into your hand. Grains, like oats, barley, and rye, dominate the diet, chosen for both caloric density and the ability to produce internal warmth. Some French sources claim that certain herbs, thyme, sage, or juniper, were believed to generate bodily heat, and were added to stews not just for flavor, but for a warming effect. Scholars still debate how much of this is rooted in science versus superstition, but the result is a comforting aroma that fills the chilly room. What fuel is an ever-present concern. You notice piles of chopped wood stacked near the hearth, but also small bundles of dried twigs, straw, and even dung cakes. Peasants used every available material to keep fires burning steadily. Fringe anecdotes describe villagers layering different fuels strategically, starting with fine twigs for a quick flame, adding dung for slow heat, and finally larger logs for sustained warmth. Historians still argue whether these techniques were standardized or improvised, but the principle of layered heating is clear and clever. Cooking tools themselves reveal adaptation to winter conditions. Heavy iron pots could retain heat long after being removed from flames. And some cottages had lids or covers specifically designed to minimize heat loss. Fringe accounts describe using stones heated in the fire, then submerged in soups or stews to maintain temperature during prolonged meals. You carefully lift one edge of a lid, feeling the lingering warmth escape, and realizing that even small innovations contributed significantly to comfort and survival. But meal timing was tactical. Breakfast, often the heartiest meal, was consumed early to fuel laborious morning tasks. Midday meals were smaller, but calorie-dense, while evening meals focused on sustenance that would release energy overnight. Fringe sources claim that in particularly harsh regions, villages would consume additional warming snacks, like roasted grains, nuts, or even spiced fats before bed to maintain body heat. Scholars still debate how uniform these practices were, but the reasoning makes sense. Strategic caloric distribution equals survival. Food storage also demanded clever planning. Root cellars, clay jars, and insulated pits allowed peasants to keep vegetables, grains, and preserved meats through freezing months. Fringe accounts suggest that some villages even buried certain foods beneath layers of straw or snow to maintain a stable temperature and flow in full temperature, a primitive form of refrigeration that relied on nature itself. The right storage kept calories available when survival demanded them most. You glance at the pots and pans scattered around the room and notice the subtle interplay of heat, light, and workflow. Cooking is not just about feeding the body, it's about maintaining warmth, using resources wisely, and orchestrating a small ecosystem of survival. Fringe tales even suggest that some families placed herbs near fires to ward off illness, combining practical benefits with superstition. Scholars debate whether these were preventive health measures or symbolic gestures, but in a cold, challenging winter, every layer of perceived protection counted. Even the choice of cooking location matters. Some cottages positioned kitchens to share warmth with sleeping areas, while outdoor pits or annexes kept smoke and odors away, but sacrificed direct heat. Fringe anecdotes describe movable hearths or braziers, allowing households to optimize warmth distribution based on wind and sun. You step back, appreciating the spatial awareness required to transform single fire into an effective thermal hub for both food preparation and living space. By the end of your observation, it's clear that cooking in winter is not merely sustenance. It's a complex interplay of fire management, caloric strategy, spatial awareness, and subtle superstition. Every pot, every ember, every carefully chosen herb or fuel source represents a piece of the intricate puzzle of survival. You step away from the hearth, feeling the heat still radiating, and realize that in a medieval cottage, the kitchen is as much a refuge from the cold as the bed or the barn. You step outside as dusk approaches, the wind sharp and unrelenting, and notice the quiet artistry of clothing in winter survival. Wool, linen, and fur are layered meticulously, each serving a purpose beyond modesty or fashion. Outer cloaks block wind, inner tunics trap warmth, and undergarments provide insulation against the creeping cold. Fringe accounts suggest that some villages even stuffed extra layers with straw or moss, turning their clothing into living thermal batteries. Historians still debate whether such practices were widely adopted or localized improvisations, but the logic is hard to ignore. More layers mean more warmth. You tug your woolen gloves tighter and examine your boots. Footwear is crucial. Leather can stiffen in frost, leading to discomfort or injury. Some peasants line boots with straw, moss, or cloth, insulating toes from the frozen ground. Fringe sources describe a technique where small heated stones were placed briefly inside boots before wearing them, a risky but effective way to ward off numbing cold. Scholars argue about the prevalence of this method, but imagining toes warmed by tiny stones is oddly satisfying. Head coverings are equally strategic. Hoods, caps, or scarves prevent heat loss from the skull, which can sap body warmth faster than any other single factor. Fringe accounts mention villages inserting small pockets of fur or wool into hoods, creating micro-insulated zones that could be adjusted depending on wind and temperature. Historians still debate whether this was widespread or limited to wealthier peasants, but even a simple wool cap dramatically increases survival odds in a biting winter. Hand coverings are multifunctional. Gloves and mittens, sometimes layered with fur, cloth, or straw, protect from frostbite while allowing basic dexterity for chores. Fringe sources describe an odd practice of fingerless straw mitts over leather gloves, practical for work and heat retention, though awkward and slightly itchy. You flex your fingers, imagining the challenge of chopping wood or tending fires with such contraptions, and marvel at the creativity born of necessity. Even the color and texture of fabrics had subtle thermal effects. Fringe, coals. Darker shades absorb more sunlight, while coarse textures trap more air, adding insulation. Fringe accounts suggest villagers often intentionally chose dull, coarse fabrics, not for aesthetics, but to enhance warmth. And in some regions, layering colors was a strategic choice to maximize heat absorption. Scholars still debate how conscious these choices were, but it's clear that medieval clothing is an understated marvel of functional design. Peasants also used belts, ties, and clasps to compress layers, reducing drafts and improving thermal efficiency. Fringe tales describe small pouches sewn into layers to hold heated stones or embers, providing localized warmth during long chores outdoors. Historians still argue whether these were isolated curiosities or a more widespread practice, but the idea of a wearable mini radiator is clever. But the bridge is broad, if slightly alarming. Beyond physical warmth, clothing served psychological purposes. Bundling up created a sense of preparedness and control against an uncontrollable environment. Fringe reports even mention garments embroidered with protective symbols or charms, or bad warnings in 710s. Combining insulation with superstition, scholars still debate whether these symbols were intended to truly ward off cold, or simply to give villagers confidence. But in practice, belief can be as potent as material warmth. Sleeping attire mirrored these principles. Nighttime layers often included additional tunics, stockings, and caps. Fringe accounts suggest that some peasants even added straw or small fur patches inside bedsheets, maximizing insulation. Historians still argue whether this was common or reserved for particularly inventive households, but it reinforces a key idea: survival in winter required attention from head to toe, even while sleeping. By evening, you step back, examining your layered ensemble, and realizing that every piece of clothing in a medieval village is an intentional, calculated response to cold. It's a fusion of practicality, observation, and fringe ingenuity that transforms mere fabric into life-saving technology. You hug yourself, feeling the combined effect of layers, and acknowledge that in winter, the right clothing isn't just comfortable, it's essential to survival. You trudge through narrow lanes dusted with frost, noticing how medieval heating relied not just on fire, but on clever placement and layering within the home. Hearths are the obvious source of warmth, but every element around them, walls, fills, furniture, works to capture and distribute heat. You feel the residual warmth radiating from timber walls, and it's clear that every beam and panel is more than structural. It's part of a carefully orchestrated thermal system. Fringe accounts suggest that some villages even used reflective surfaces, like polished metal trays or water-filled basins, to redirect heat toward beds or work areas. Historians still argue whether these methods were widespread or local improvisations, but the principle is sound. Heat retention and distribution are as critical as the fire itself. You crouch near a hearth and notice how the placement of cooking pots, stones, and metal utensils contributes to radiating warmth. Stones heated by fire could be moved into beds or resting areas, offering portable warmth for those with stiff, frozen limbs. Fringe sources describe tiny heat carriers, small, sealed containers filled with hot coals, passed from room to room, a clever workaround when fuel was scarce. Scholars still debate whether these devices were practical or more of a fringe practice, but imagining their use in the dead of winter adds a new layer to the ingenuity of medieval domestic life. Footnote: walls are reinforced with tapestries, cloth, or straw layers, effectively creating insulation. You brush your fingers along a rough linen hanging and feel how it traps air. Close, slowing the escape of heat. Fringe accounts suggest that some homes layered multiple fabrics strategically, creating zones of warmth that could be adjusted as temperature shifted throughout the day. Historians still debate the consistency of these techniques, but the outcome is unmistakable. Thoughtful layering transforms a simple hut into a survival haven. Even furniture serves a thermal purpose. Benches, chests, and beds are positioned to reduce drafts and retain warmth. Our fringe reports describe placing straw or cloth atop wooden surfaces to provide a soft, insulated buffer against cold wood. Scholars still argue whether these arrangements were guided by superstition or purely practical observation, but the effect is real. Every surface contributes to comfort and survival. Nighttime strategies extend beyond beds and hearths. Light. Small alcoves, niches, and enclosed sleeping areas allow for concentrated heat retention. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some villages constructed temporary partitions or canopies around sleeping mats, forming heat tents that captured body warmth. You notice that ventilation is managed carefully. Chimneys and hearths direct smoke out while minimizing heat loss. Maybe fringe accounts claim that some households used small clay or metal channels to circulate warm air to adjoining rooms, a primitive form of central heating. Scholars still debate the extent of such innovations, but not weak. But the idea of directing warm air consciously demonstrates remarkable thermal awareness. Even everyday objects are adapted for warmth. Small textiles, cushions, and mats can be moved strategically to protect against drafts. Fringe sources describe hanging damp cloths briefly near the fire to humidify and slightly warm rooms, a subtle but effective method in arid, frozen air. Scholars still argue whether such practices were widespread or experimental, but they reflect the medieval tendency to make multi-purpose use of resources. Animals remain integral indoors. Pets and livestock generate consistent heat, and their strategic placement amplifies the effect of the hearth. Fringe anecdotes describe villages rotating animals in sleeping areas or near workspaces to maximize distributed warmth. Historians still debate whether this was a systemic practice or a local adaptation. And fringes, but the benefits are obvious. Living bodies add both heat and companionship. By evening, you step back and appreciate the sophisticated interplay of fire, structure, and habit. Every hearth, wall, piece of furniture, and living creature contributes to a complex thermal system that shields peasants from winter's relentless chill. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling the residual heat lingering in the cottage, lips, and recognize that survival isn't just about fire or clothing. It's about orchestrating every element of daily life into a cohesive, warmth-preserving symphony. You step outside as snow begins to fall, tiny crystalline flakes clinging to your cloak, and realize that medieval peasants relied heavily on cluttered dietary strategies to maintain body heat. Food isn't just nourishment, it's a portable furnace. Porridges, stews, and roasted root vegetables provide calories that convert into warmth, fueling labor and keeping frostbite at bay. Fringe sources suggest that some peasants added spices, like pepper, ginger, or mustard seeds, to increase circulation, believing that these foods literally stirred heat into the body. Historians still debate whether such culinary choices were widespread or mainly superstition, but they reveal a fascinating blend of observation and belief. You stir a pot of barley and carrots, feeling the steam rise against your face, and notice that timing of meals is critical. Breakfast is typically the heaviest, powering morning labor, while midday meals are lighter but still dense, and evening meals are designed to sustain the body overnight. Fringe accounts describe villages consuming small, warming snacks before bed, nuts, roasted grains, and a bona res, or fatty morsels, strategically placed to release energy slowly through the cold night. Scholars argue whether this practice was localized or common, but the logic is undeniable. Distributed caloric intake equals survival. Storage is another battleground against winter. Root cellars, clay jars, and insulated pits keep vegetables, grains, and preserved meats viable through months of frost. Fringe tales suggest that some families buried food under layers of straw or even snow to stabilize temperatures, using nature itself as a refrigerator. Historians still debate the efficiency of such methods, but the principle is simple. Maintaining access to calories is as crucial as the calories themselves. Meat preservation is an art. Smoked, salted, or dried meats retain protein and energy longer. You notice small slabs of bacon and hams hanging near the hearth, their warmth balanced to avoid spoilage, yet stay accessible. Fringe accounts described hanging meats behind cloth screens or over low embers to maintain a delicate balance of heat, preventing freezing without cooking them. Scholars still argue how common this technique was, but it highlights the creativity of winter food strategies. Even the simplest foods serve multiple purposes. Root vegetables, dense grains, and fatty scraps provide not just calories, but micronutrients that stave off cold-related illnesses. Fringe reports claim that certain herbs, when added to dishes, were thought to strengthen the body against frost, a practice that blends nutrition with superstition. Historians still debate the practical versus symbolic value of these herbs, but the effect is clear. Meals were carefully designed to fight the cold from the inside out. Communal meals amplify warmth as well. Villagers often ate together, sharing both food and body heat in crowded kitchens or barns. Fringe anecdotes describe heated benches or mats placed around shared tables, enhancing thermal efficiency during long, cold meals. Scholars still debate whether this practice was primarily for warmth, social bonding, or both. But the combined effect of calories and human proximity is undeniable. You notice that preparation techniques themselves generate heat. Boiling, roasting, and stirring require motion, providing short bursts of warmth for the cook. Fringe sources describe multitasking strategies, like carrying hot utensils between rooms, or using heated stones to maintain simmering pots while performing other chores. Historians still argue about how standardized these practices were, but the principle is clear. The act of cooking is a form of active heat production. Even the smallest foods can serve as thermal tools. Hot broth, spiced liquids, and fatty morsels are consumed strategically during breaks, maintaining core warmth during outdoor labor. Fringe reports mention villagers carrying small, wrapped snacks in pockets of straw or cloth to preserve heat until consumption. Scholars still debate the ubiquity of this practice, but its logic is compelling. Portable calories are portable warmth. By the end of the day, you realize that medieval diet is a sophisticated survival system. Each ingredient, cooking method, and timing decision contributes to both nutrition and thermal comfort. You sip a warm cup of broth, feeling its heat travel from your stomach outward, and appreciate the ingenuity required to turn simple foods into multi-layered survival tools. In this frozen world, what you eat is literally part of the fight against winter. You step back into the village streets as twilight deepens, noticing the delicate choreography of nighttime chores that supplement survival strategies. Water carried, animals fed, fires tended, all must be performed with both speed and efficiency to minimize exposure to the bitter cold. Historians still argue whether the timing of these tasks followed a strict routine or was improvised based on immediate needs. But either way, each action is a dance against frost and darkness. Fringe accounts even describe villagers wearing small pouches of embers to provide momentary warmth during outdoor chores, a risky but ingenious solution. You pause by a barn, watching a villager transfer hay to livestock. Even this mundane task has subtle thermal benefits. Movement generates warmth, and proximity to animals allows for shared heat. Fringe sources mention rotating animals between barns and cottages at night, ensuring that body heat from livestock contributes to household warmth. Need to unpresent warmth. Scholars still debate how widespread this practice was, but the principle is clear. Animals are both resources and living heaters. Fire maintenance dominates the evening routine. Herds must remain alive, producing enough heat to sustain the household through nightfall. Fringe accounts describe creative fire management techniques, like layering fuel by burn rate, tinder for immediate flame, dung for slow embers, and larger logs for sustained warmth. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these methods, but any technique that prolongs heat while conserving scarce resources is valuable. You observe the careful organization of tools and materials for nighttime chores. Buckets, brooms, and wooden implements are placed strategically near the hearth or entrances to reduce repeated exposure to cold. Fringe reports describe the use of small portable braziers or heated stones to create temporary warm zones during specific tasks. F.A. Volunteer. An adaptation that blends practicality with comfort. Scholars still debate whether such practices were common or experimental, but the underlying logic is straightforward. A and arc. Efficiency equals survival. Even the act of clothing adjustment becomes ritualized. Layers are added or removed depending on task, and gloves or hoods are swapped to balance warmth with dexterity. Fringe sources describe a practice of placing small pieces of fur inside gloves or shoes at night, where today you will lose the long cross, boosting thermal protection for sensitive extremities. Historians still argue whether these micro-adaptations were widespread, but you can't deny the ingenuity behind them. Children are integrated into these routines with surprising sophistication. Tasks are often light but purposeful, keeping them active and generating warmth, while contributing to household labor. The house is evil with mass. Fringe accounts mention playful competitions, carrying firewood, fetching water, or arranging straw that simultaneously train stamina and maintain body heat. Scholars still debate whether these were genuine cultural practices or anecdotal tales, but they reveal a blend of necessity and subtle education. Small safety precautions are also embedded into evening chores. Walkways are cleared of ice, embers monitored for smoke hazards, and doors or shutters checked against drafts. Fringe reports describe villagers sprinkling sand, ash, or straw along icy paths to reduce slipping, while also providing temporary insulation for feet. Historians still argue about how systematic these precautions were, but they underscore the attention to detail required for survival in a harsh climate. By the time darkness fully envelops the village, you see that even the simplest tasks, feeding animals, fetching water, or managing embers, are carefully choreographed for both survival and thermal efficiency. Every step, every movement, every adaptation enhances warmth, conserves resources, and reduces exposure to danger. You wrap your cloak tighter and realize that medieval life is a continuous balancing act, where labor, observation, and ingenuity intertwine to fend off the relentless grip of winter. You trudge back to the main cottage as night deepens, noticing the layered strategies for personal rest that peasants relied upon. Beds are rarely just fabric and stuffing. They are carefully engineered nests of warmth. Straw mattresses, layered blankets, furs, and sometimes even small heated stones combine to create a thermal cocoon. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers placed embers inside clay pots near the bed, providing gentle radiating warmth throughout the night. Historians still debate how common these methods were, but the principle is clear. Sleep is both restorative and defensive. You climb onto a straw-filled mattress and adjust your layering, feeling the insulation contour around you. Medieval peasants often slept in shifts or rotated positions to optimize heat distribution among family members. Fringe sources even describe the practice of huddling close to livestock at night, not just for warmth, but some precious crash. But because animals emitted consistent body heat that was surprisingly effective, scholars still argue whether this was a widespread practice or limited to rural households. But the combination of human and animal warmth is undeniably clever. The arrangement of bedding often reflects a subtle hierarchy of warmth needs. Elders, young children, and those performing heavy labor might be placed where heat naturally accumulates, near walls or hearths, while others take less insulated positions. Fringe accounts describe creative positioning, angled beds, night cuts, but those of the world might be shared furs or layered mats to maximize retention and minimize drafts. Historians still debate whether this was standard procedure or adapted individually, but the thoughtful placement underscores the care invested in survival. Even clothing during sleep is strategic. Tunics, stockings, caps, and gloves remain on, and layers may include straw padding or animal furs. Fringe reports suggest that some peasants added aromatic herbs like lavender or juniper to bedding, not only for scent, but because they believed it preserved warmth or ward off spirits. Scholars still argue whether this practice was superstition or effective insulation, but the multifunctionality of materials is apparent. Nighttime rituals extend beyond layering. Peasants sometimes employed small protective charms or spoken blessings, blending superstition with psychological comfort. Fringe sources describe whispered incantations over heated stones or blankets, intended to keep frost, spirits, or disease at bay. Historians still debate the practical versus symbolic effect of these rituals, but the mental reassurance they provided is clear. Confidence itself improves sleep quality, which is critical when survival depends on rest. What? You notice how cottages are arranged to conserve heat. Narrow sleeping areas trap warmth, thick walls prevent draft infiltration, and doorways are sometimes covered with extra cloth at night. Fringe reports mention temporary partitions constructed from wood or fabric to create warm rooms within a larger space, a practical solution to the challenge of shared living quarters. Scholars still argue whether such solutions were common or experimental, that the logic is hard to ignore. Containment of heat amplifies comfort. Even movement within the sleeping area is purposeful. Hands adjust layers, feet nudge closer to body heat sources, and the slightest repositioning prevents chilling. Fringe accounts describe careful placement of warm stones at strategic points, feet, hands, or torso, to maintain core warmth. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread practice or a fringe technique, but the attentiveness reveals a sophisticated understanding of thermal physiology. You settle into a quiet rhythm, feeling the combined warmth of bedding, clothing, and perhaps even an adjacent animal. Every element, the straw, the blankets, the embers, the careful positioning, works together to create a cocoon against the cold. Fringe sources suggest that the placement of objects, even small personal items, contributed to heat distribution, and demonstrating that survival extended into the smallest details of domestic life. By the time sleep draws near, you understand that the medieval night is not a passive experience. It's an orchestrated sequence of preparation, layering, and subtle adaptation. You tuck closer, feeling the warmth accumulate, and realize that rest in winter is a deliberate, multi-layered act of survival. Every element, from stones to furs to human proximity, contributes to an intricate thermal ecosystem designed to see you safely through the coldest hours. You wake to the faint glow of embers in the hearth, the cold still biting at the edges of your blankets, and notice that medieval peasants often began their day with small, lad onward pearl, how bad they were. Calculated movements to gradually generate body warmth. Simple stretches, brisk walking, or tending to indoor fires serve as microthermogenic activities, allowing the body to awaken without sudden exposure to the harsh cold. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers even performed rhythmic clapping or chanting while moving indoors, believing that vibration stimulated warmth. Stroke, ED5. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread cultural practice or isolated superstition, but the principle, motion equals heat, is undeniably practical. Breakfast, the most critical meal of the day, is carefully composed. Porridge thickened with grains, supplemented by fats from preserved meats or dairy, provides sustained caloric output. Fringe sources indicate that certain herbs or spices were added not just for flavor, but to activate internal warmth. A blend of observation and folk belief. Scholars argue whether these ingredients truly had a measurable effect on body temperature, or served more as ritualistic reassurance, but the combination of calories and psychology proves effective. You step outside to collect firewood, feeling the frozen ground resist every step, and realize that physical labor is itself a defense against frostbite. Every swing of the axe or lift of a log generates internal heat, while outdoor exposure trains endurance. Fringe anecdotes describe peasants timing work intervals with small insulated breaks near embers or sunlit spots to prevent excessive chilling. Historians still debate the intentionality of these schedules, but the results speak for themselves. Movement combats the cold efficiently. Livestock are moved into insulated shelters, and some houses allow animals to share limited interior space, providing consistent heat. Fringe accounts suggest rotating animals at night and morning to balance warmth distribution throughout the household. Scholars still argue how standardized these methods were. Lays, sleep, weeks, love. But the principle of using living heat sources is both ingenious and effective. Water management continues as a survival priority. Fetching frozen or partially frozen water demands careful technique. Weeks. Layering gloves and using insulation to prevent damage to hands. Fringe sources report that some peasants carried small heated containers or stones to thaw ice gradually while minimizing exposure. Historians still debate the prevalence of this practice, but it illustrates how even mundane chores are entwined with thermal strategy. Fire maintenance dominates morning routines. Hearths are refueled and embers carefully nurtured to ensure consistent heat, supporting both cooking and indoor warmth. Scholars still debate whether these strategies were codified or improvised, but the careful orchestration of fire is unmistakably central to survival. Clothing adjustments are subtle but vital, and the layers may be added or removed based on activity, and small insulating enhancements, like fur inserts or straw padding, are positioned to maximize warmth without restricting movement. Fringe sources describe placing heated stones or cloth pouches inside garments briefly to ward off morning peace. Chill. Historians still argue about how widespread these techniques were, but the ingenuity is undeniable. By midday, the combined effect of movement, food, and layered insulation becomes apparent. You feel a steady warmth that belies the frozen landscape outside. Every step, swing of an axe, and strategic layering of clothing demonstrates how medieval peasants orchestrated their daily existence to maintain heat and energy. Fringe and mainstream methods intertwine seamlessly, showing a sophisticated, weakened, pride, creed, craze, karma, lived understanding of human thermoregulation, born of necessity rather than science. You trudge toward the village outbuildings as the afternoon sun sinks low, noticing how resourcefulness extends into building design and insulation. Walls, roofs, and flooring are carefully arranged to conserve warmth. Thick timber beams, wattle-endured walls, and straw-stuffed ceilings trap heat, while narrow entrances minimize drafts. Fringe accounts describe the use of small, cold savage, movable wooden panels or shutters to further control airflow, especially during blizzards. Historians still debate how widespread these methods were, But the principle is clear. Architecture is a passive yet vital element of winter survival. You step into a storage shed and feel the residual warmth radiating from stored goods. Food, firewood, and tools are not only stockpiled for convenience, but strategically placed to retain heat. Fringe sources suggest that even stacking techniques were designed to create insulated zones, barrels behind walls, acting buttons, straw interlaced with firewood, and grains stored in thick sacks. Scholars still argue whether these arrangements were the product of practical necessity or local innovation, but the result is the same. Careful planning prolongs warmth and resources. Roofs are designed to shed snow while maintaining internal insulation. You brush off a layer of frozen flakes and notice how overhangs and thatching help prevent ice buildup near living areas. Fringe reports claim that some villagers, Hygeman could not die, even layered moss or clay atop thatch to enhance thermal resistance. Historians still debate the prevalence and efficacy of such methods, but these adaptations demonstrate an understanding of microclimate management. Flooring is another overlooked thermal strategy. Dirt floors are often covered with straw, rushes, or mats to insulate against the frozen ground. Fringe anecdotes suggest that certain villagers constructed slightly elevated wooden platforms to create air pockets beneath beds or workspaces, adding an extra layer of thermal buffering. Scholars still argue about how common these methods were, but the concept is ingenious. Trapping air increases insulation without additional material costs. They may be covered with oiled cloth, parchment, or wooden shutters, balancing light entry with insulation. Fringe sources suggest layering multiple coverings during blizzards, and some peasants even used small, transparent animal bladders as primitive glazing. Historians still debate the practicality of such techniques, but it's remarkable how necessity drives experimentation. Even our buildings, like barns and workshops, are adapted for warmth. Positioning near the main hearth or sharing walls with cottages allows heat to radiate outward. Fringe accounts describe temporary partitions or hanging coffs to create micro-warm zones within larger grafty structures. Scholars still argue whether these innovations were systemic or sporadic, but the principle of transferring and concentrating heat is clear. You notice that snow itself becomes part of thermal planning. Packed snow against walls or around outbuildings can act as insulation, slowing heat loss from interiors. Fringe anecdotes describe layering straw and snow strategically to protect vulnerable structures. CADs of company private heat houses. Historians still debate the effectiveness of this technique, but in a world reliant on natural resources, every advantage counts. By evening, you step back and admire the quiet brilliance of structural ingenuity. What a massive stone fashion! Every wall, floor, roof, and window works in tandem to conserve heat, protect resources, and reduce exposure to the relentless winter. You realize that medieval survival isn't just about fire, food, or clothing. It's an orchestrated symphony where architecture, material science, and observation converge. Even the smallest structural decision can amplify warmth, proving that ingenuity often thrives under extreme conditions. You wander through the village as dusk falls, noticing how community itself becomes a vital tool for winter survival. Social structures, shared labor, and collective knowledge amplify the effectiveness of individual strategies. Peasants frequently collaborated to chop firewood, fetch water, or repair shelters, distributing effort and minimizing exposure. Fringe accounts suggest organized fire brigades or rotating shifts to maintain communal warmth during particularly harsh nights. But historians still debate how formalized these practices were, but the benefits of cooperation in a frigid environment are undeniable. You pass by a cluster of cottages where neighbors exchange not only goods, but information. Advice about optimal layering, storage techniques, or the best way to fall frozen wells circulates informally yet efficiently. Fringe sources mention small ritual gatherings or communal storytelling sessions that serve dual purposes: morale boosting and knowledge sharing. Scholars still argue whether these were universal or localized customs, but the idea of learning through social interaction reinforces survival. Mutual aid extends to childcare and elder care. You notice small children guided by older siblings or neighbors, while adults perform demanding chores. Fringe accounts describe shared responsibilities for feeding, clothing, and supervising youth, ensuring both safety and warmth. Historians still debate whether this represented formal societal rules or ad hoc arrangements, but the practical outcome is clear. Fair, broke, collective effort reduces vulnerability. Community gatherings around central hearths or barns are as much about warmth as social cohesion. Fringe reports describe end of social media, RIP, and warmth. Infrequent base is an interest. Pooling resources like straw and firewood, and sharing heated stones to extend warmth across spaces. Scholars still argue how common this practice was, but the logic is irrefutable. Look, heat shared multiplies the effect of individual efforts. Information networks include subtle observation of weather and seasonal patterns. Vidges communicate predictions about snowfall, frost severity, and river freezing through verbal reports or informal signs. Fringe accounts even suggest coded markers on doors or fences to indicate hazardous areas or safe water points. Historians still debate the reliability and extent of these kinds methods, but the coordination of knowledge clearly improves survival odds. You notice that communal rituals often blend superstition with practical benefit. Seasonal celebrations, protective charms, and small offerings may appear symbolic, yet they often coincide with crucial maintenance tasks. Now, like reinforcing roofs or preparing food stores, Fringe sources describe these rituals as time markers, ensuring that essential winter preparation happens punctually. Scholars still debate whether these were purely spiritual or partially functional, but the intertwining of culture and survival is evident. Even casual social interactions have thermal advantages. Sharing enclosed spaces, huddling in groups during outdoor work, or gathering near shared hearths contributes warmth while fostering emotional resilience. Fringe accounts note that shared storytelling and singing near fires may have helped regulate body temperature through coordinated movement and vocal effort. Historians still argue about the physiological impact, but the combination of morale, warmth, and shared labor is striking. By nightfall, you recognize that survival is not just a matter of individual ingenuity, it is a collective enterprise. The village itself is an organism, each household, task, and interaction contributing to a shared thermal and social ecosystem. You breathe in the cold night air, aware that human cooperation, observation, and shared knowledge amplify every effort to endure the relentless winter. In this frozen world, the strength of community often matters as much as fire, food, and clothing. You finally settle inside your cottage as the last light fades, reflecting on the intricate web of strategies that medieval peasants used to survive the deepest nights. Every layer of clothing, every ember tended, every chore performed outside or inside, all combine into a coordinated system of endurance. Fringe accounts describe the use of tiny personal rituals, warming hands over a small pot of water, whispering blessings to a hearth, or arranging furs just so, demonstrating how observation, superstition, and practical experience intertwine. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these practices, but the ingenuity is unmistakable. You glance at the sleeping area, noting straw-stuffed mattresses, layered blankets, and furs, sometimes augmented with heated stones. Fringe sources even suggest placing aromatic herbs or small charms between layers to enhance psychological warmth and ward off spirits or illness. Scholars still debate whether these were purely right, symbolic, or also contributed materially to thermal comfort, but the cumulative effect is impressive. Centuries of trial and error condensed into subtle, life-saving techniques. Food remains central to winter survival. Meals are strategically timed and composed, designed to generate both immediate and sustained warmth. Stews, porridge, roasted root vegetables, and preserved meats fuel labor and maintain energy reserves. Fringe accounts mention carrying small heated snacks during outdoor work, or placing warming stones in containers to keep liquids from freezing. Historians still argue whether, amidst these methods were widely practiced, but they highlight the careful attention to caloric efficiency and resourcefulness. Even architecture contributes to survival. Thick walls, insulated roofs, elevated beds, and narrow entrances help trap and distribute heat. Fringe anecdotes describe temporary partitions, layered coverings, and clever use of snow and straw for insulation, all designed to create microclimates within otherwise harsh structures. The village as a whole operates like a coordinated organism. Shared labor, information exchange, and communal rituals amplify warmth and efficiency. Fringe accounts note that rotating tasks, sharing embers, and social gatherings around central hearths distribute heat, conserve resources, and boost morale. Historians still argue about the formalization of such practices, but it's evident that community cooperation is an essential survival strategy. By now, you feel a profound sense of interconnectedness. Every fire tended, every meal prepared, every layer of clothing, and every shared effort is part of a comprehensive system honed to endure winter's relentless grip. Fringe and mainstream practices overlap seamlessly, revealing a culture built on observation, adaptation, and collaboration. As you sink into your bedding, the warmth of layered furs and residual embers wrapping around you, you realize that survival is a constant negotiation with the elements. It is a mix of ingenuity, resilience, community, and sometimes superstition. The medieval peasant's world may seem harsh, but it is also filled with subtle intelligence, creativity, and quiet triumphs against a winter that never relents. You exhale slowly, feeling the comfort of layered warmth, and let the knowledge of these meticulous strategies lull you toward rest. The pain stops to work at the borders and fields, to press and the esteem of the free swearing. As the night stretches on, allow your mind to soften, letting the vivid images of medieval cottages, hearths, and snow-laden villages fade gently. Imagine the warmth of layered furs, the gentle crackle of embers, and the comforting aroma of simmering stews filling the air around you. Feel the rhythm of quiet movement, the careful steps to tend fires, the rustle of straw-filled mattresses, and the faint hum of conversation among villagers sharing warmth and stories. These small, deliberate acts create a sense of calm and continuity, a reminder that even in the coldest, most unforgiving winters, resourcefulness and care bring comfort. Let your thoughts drift to the subtle ingenuity woven through everyday life, and the communal efforts that extend warmth beyond any single household. Each detail, from the smallest charm tucked into blankets to the positioning of furniture and animals, contributes to a quiet, wide fancy favor. Persistent resilience. You can almost feel the gentle pulse of life, steady and enduring, despite the icy air outside. Now, sink deeper into the softness of your own bed, carrying with you the knowledge that survival often comes down to simple yet brilliant adaptations. Inhale slowly, imagining the heat spreading through your body, and exhale, releasing tension with each breath. A medieval night, with all its challenges, serves as a gentle lesson in patience, observation, and the quiet triumph of human ingenuity. Allow your mind to soften completely, letting warmth and reassurance settle into every corner of thought, until your body and spirit drift effortlessly into rest, wrapped in the cozy embrace of centuries-old wisdom.